Allora, buonasera a tutti e a tutte, anche a chi ci segue a distanza da varie città. Questa lezione di oggi è al tempo stesso la prima lezione del corso di Storia della filosofia contemporanea che tengo a Roma 3, ma è anche, direi soprattutto, la lezione che avvia un progetto di ricerca nazionale, PRIN, che si chiama Understanding Natural Histories, comprendere la storia naturale, le storie naturali, che include l'Università, il Politecnico di Torino, l'Università di Venezia UAV, l'Università di Padova, quindi vari colleghi e studenti che sono anche collegati adesso da casa, e il cui scopo è esaminare il concetto di storia naturale, cioè l'idea stessa di questa disciplina che esiste fin dall'antichità, in varie chiavi. Quindi che cosa vuol dire fare una storia naturale? In che senso è solo naturale della mente, della sessualità e naturalmente in senso stretto delle forme viventi. La lezione di oggi toccherà anche questo tema. Avremo poi qui la possibilità da Roma 3 anche di accedere a tutte queste lezioni che si svolgeranno in varie sedi con scadenza mensile. E oggi appunto si comincia con un ospite eccellente, il professor Dale Jamieson, che adesso presento brevemente perché poi vorrei insomma lasciare il tempo alla presentazione che appunto superati gli ostacoli tecnologici dovrebbe essere visibile con delle slide che aiuteranno perché il professore parlerà in inglese e anche per avere un po' di tempo per la discussione, per cui non voglio dilungarmi. Ma almeno, insomma, per chi non lo conoscesse, voglio presentare Dale Jamieson, che è professore emerito a New York University, che ha avuto un ruolo fondamentale non soltanto nel dirigere, ma nel fondare il reparto di Animal Studies e Environmental Studies alla New York University e ha pubblicato diversi libri e articoli sia sul tema della mente animale, sia su temi di ecologia e conservazione ambientale. Un suo libro, Ethics and the Environment, che è un'introduzione a questo campo, è in uscita, o comunque è appena uscito in una seconda edizione che verrà tradotto anche in italiano fra pochi mesi. Ha pubblicato anche Reason in a Dark Time, che è un libro critico e anche storico sul problema ecologico, molto importante. E dunque ha affrontato temi che chiaramente sono molto pertinenti e con grande autorevolezza, pertinenti per il nostro progetto. E quindi, insomma, il fatto di poter cominciare questo percorso con una sua lezione è particolarmente prezioso. Il tema della lezione di oggi del Jamieson, in particolare, con questo titolo che ora magari lui ci spiegherà direttamente, How to Love What is Red in Tooth and Claw, è il rapporto tra la conoscenza degli animali, degli altri esseri viventi, in genere della natura, e il rapporto affettivo che possiamo avere con questi esseri. Jamieson ha pubblicato anche su questo degli articoli molto interessanti e ha anche pubblicato un libro tradotto tra l'altro in italiano con una scrittrice di fiction su questo tema che si chiama in italiano Amore e Antropocene. Quindi diciamo una produzione molto eterogenea, come si addice anche a portarci in un percorso interdisciplinare, che è quello che iniziamo con questo progetto. E quindi io senz'altro lascerei la parola a Dale Jamieson. Adesso faccio una condivisione dello schermo e gli chiedo di mettersi qui in postazione e poi appunto al termine della presentazione ci sarà spazio insomma per discussione, per domande.
Well, first of all, thank you all for being here, either in reality or in the ether. If you can't hear me or if I speak too quickly and make it difficult to understand, please feel free to just start waving a hand or something like that. I'm very aware that you're all listening to me talk in your second language. And if I were to try to understand you in my second language, this would not have come to a good end. So thank you very much for your patience and your interest. So the talk today is called How to Love What Is Red in Tooth and Claw. And yeah, I'm trying. Okay, right. And um, so I want to begin with something that, if it's not quite a logical paradox, it at least seems paradoxical. And that is, how is it possible, reasonable, or plausible to suppose that people love nature, right? I mean, in some ways, we may take that for granted, but there is something paradoxical about this. So on the left side, yes, it's the left side, there is a passage that's quoted from a poem by the English romantic poet Williams Wordsworth, where he is holding forth about the beauties of nature and the wonders of nature and is expressing his love for nature. So this is a sort of paradigm of somebody expressing love for nature. And then on the right side, we have some quotations, first from John Stuart Mill and then from the biologist Richard Dawkins. I won't read those quotations out in their entirety, but what Mill is saying is that the things that we consider to be worst about humanity, killing each other, torturing each other, things of that nature, are really just common occurrences in nature. Nature is full of killing and the causing of gratuitous suffering. And Richard Dawkins actually puts the point in a much more direct and stark way when he writes that during the minute that it takes me to compose this sentence, thousands of animals are being eaten alive. Many things are running for their lives, whimpering with fear. Others are slowly being devoured from within by grasping parasites. Thousands of all kinds are dying of starvation, thirst, and disease. Okay? So this is all going on in nature, but yet Wordsworth and others express their love for nature. There does seem to be something, at least, that stands in need of some explanation here. Now, okay, that one. Okay. Okay. So I'm going to begin by making two assumptions. So the first assumption is that nature is as red in tooth and claw as Mill and Dawkins suggest. In other words, I'm not going to try to tell a story about how, well, nature, not really so bad. When one animal tears another one to pieces, it doesn't really cause that much pain. It's not really so bad. I'm not going to go there. So I'm going to accept that nature, in fact, is a domain that's in which there is enormous pain and suffering. The second assumption I'm going to make is that, in fact, some people do love nature. So we saw Wordsworth, for example. But I do want to grant that not everybody loves nature. There are people, for example, who have a purely extractivist attitude towards nature. Nature is just a collection of resources to be mined and to be used for human purposes. The idea of loving nature would be sort of like the idea of loving a grocery store, right? Because it serves the same function. There are other people who are simply indifferent to nature. You've probably been on walks with people like that. You're walking up a beautiful mountain or on an incredible trail, and they're just talking, 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 talking all the time, completely indifferent to all of these things that are going on around them in the natural world. There are other people, I think, who would deny loving nature. These may be mostly philosophers who think that love is a relation that really only exists or only properly exists between people. And so they might say, well, I have a lot of sympathy for nature, a lot of affection for nature, all kinds of things like that. but I don't really love nature because you can only love another person. And as you'll see, I think those people have a false theory of love. So I think those people actually do love nature, even if they deny that they love nature. And then, of course, there are those of us who simply will avow and assert that we love nature. Wordsworth is one of them. I'm one of them. And so is a woman named Katie Lee, who I'm going to tell you about now. So Katie Lee was a woman who died relatively recently at almost 100 years of age. She was an outdoorsman. She was a musician. She was an artist. She was a photographer. And the place that she loved in particular was a place called Glen Canyon, which is a geological formation that's in Utah, in the western United States, in what is sometimes called the Interbasin West. And this is a photograph of Katie Lee. This is what she used to do. She would prance around these canyons, around Glen Canyon, naked, just communing with the canyon, with the place that she loved. What happened is that in the 1970s, a dam was built which stopped the waters that fed the canyon. This is the Glen Canyon Dam. And what happened when the Glen Canyon Dam was built is that an area that looked like this is a photograph taken before the dam was built, uh, became something that looked like this. And of course, there was massive disruption with all of the wildlife and plant life that had existed in this canyon. And uh, and towards the end of her life, Katie Lee gave an interview at the Telluride Film Festival. And in that interview, she said, "When they drowned that place, they drowned my whole guts. And I will never forgive the bastards. May they rot in hell." Now, that's the attitude that one has when somebody destroys something that one loves. So, so now that I've been clear about the assumptions that I've been making and given you the feel for what it's like for one person in one place when that person loved the place, I want to try to give a somewhat more systematic account of this thing called love, which I've done in a paper that I later reference on one of these slides. But the inspiration for this account really comes from the English philosopher and novelist Iris Murdoch. And I am going to read this quotation because this is a remarkably dense quotation that has a lot in it. So Murdoch writes, "Love is the perception of individuals. Love is the extremely difficult realization that something other than oneself is real. Love is the discovery of reality. What stuns us into a realization of our supersensible destiny is not the formlessness of nature, but rather its unutterable particularity." So I'm going to try then to unpack this quotation. And the account of love that I've given is that roughly love is a stance taken towards an individual. And I'll say more about that condition in a moment. Secondly, love involves respect for autonomy. Say something about that as well. And love requires making oneself vulnerable in a particular way. There are two other conditions about which I won't say much, namely that love, a loving relation, displays what I call quasi-transitivity, and it also has a tendency towards universality. I'll say something about that, but not much. I'll focus on these first three conditions. So love takes individuals as its object. And the contrast that I want to draw here is between love and compassion. Love is for an individual. Compassion is a generalized sense of benevolence or goodwill towards towards a class, towards a group of individuals, rather than towards a particularity. Now, now, one way of bringing out this difference, but also, as I will later show, can in fact be reconciled in a surprising way, comes from a quotation from the brothers Karamazov by Dostoevsky, where one of the characters says, I love mankind, but I find to my amazement that the more I love mankind as a whole, the less I love man in particular. Now, as often the case, great works of literature can also be expressed more trenchantly in cartoons. And this is Charlie Brown saying, I love mankind. It's people I can't stand. And if you remember what poor Charlie Brown had to go through, or maybe this is Linus, I don't know, you would sympathize with his attitude. Now, what I think is a little bit tricky about this is that individuals are actually pragmatically determined. So it's not as though there are things in the world that are just simply individuals and things in the world that are just simply not individuals. What counts as an individual depends on context and circumstance. It's relative to some set of factors. So Glen Canyon is individualized both by conventional boundaries. It's a park. When I'm talking about Glen Canyon, I'm talking about the park Glen Canyon, but it's also individualized by natural boundaries. It's this canyon I'm talking about, to be distinguished from the things around it. And so if we go back to the Brothers Karamazov quote, what we can see is, for example, I love this individual who I have a picture of. Her name is Chun Mei Lee. She's my partner. And I love her as an individual relative to this mass of humanity. I don't love this mass of humanity. I love this individual member of humanity, Chun Mei Lee. But you can imagine somebody who actually does love humanity relative to all of life on the planet. So the individual thing, whoops, sorry. So the individual thing that they love is actually humanity, not the whole mass of life on the planet. So because the concept of an individual is a concept that's relative to a contrast class, it is, after all, possible to love humanity, but not love individuals, humans, because what the love of humanity is being contrasted to is something like the love of all living things. And that's the general class, then, of which humanity is an instance. But however, in a particular case, something is individualized, the object of love is an individual relative to some class. Thank you, Paula. Okay, now I also said that love involves respect for autonomy, but I use the word autonomy in a very thin sense. Kant and his followers stole the word autonomy, and I want them to give it back. There is a thinner and older notion of autonomy that is closer to a kind of conception of autonomy that you might find in someone like John Locke. But I mean it really probably in an even thinner sense. And what I mean by respecting autonomy by respecting the autonomy of Glen Canyon, for example, certainly involves appreciating its own dynamics and mechanisms of change. That's a minimal condition for respecting autonomy in this thin sense in which I'm using the term. And it may also involve leaving the thing alone to the maximum degree possible. And it may even mean protecting the thing from the incursions of others. But respect for autonomy, I simply mean something like appreciation for the other and non-interference with the other. For something to be autonomous, it simply has to have some set of internal dynamics and mechanisms for change. It doesn't have to have reason in the sort of grandiose Kantian sense or anything like that. Now, the third condition of love that I mentioned is that love involves making oneself vulnerable in a particular way. And you saw that Katie Lee was that her love for Glen Canyon made her enormously vulnerable to the destruction of the canyon. Hence the crying out in pain, the expression of grief. And so the loss of what is loved involves an irreparable sense of loss. That is, in some ways, I think, properly characterized as being beyond grief. It's palpable, it's distinctive, and it's persistent. And in time, I think the pain from losing what one loves may become encapsulated, contextualized, but will still sometimes erupt into consciousness, even if less frequently. And the loss of what one loves remains a permanent part of who we are and how we experience life. Think of the loss of a parent. Think of the loss of a companion animal with whom one has formed a very strong relationship. This sense of loss never fully goes away, even if it is less present in consciousness. Now, just as a kind of shout out, there's a recent book that's just been published by Lydia Millett called We Loved It All, A Memory of Life, which I think is an extremely good expression of the sort of thing I'm talking about with respect to a love of nature. And in particular, she's talking about the sixth extinction that's now underway. We loved it all. We loved all of those living things. We love all of that life that is now becoming a memory as we lose it in the present. Now, I mentioned these other two conditions, quasi-transitivity and a tendency towards universality. And I'm not going to go into them in detail because they aren't central to trying to resolve the tension or the paradox with which this talk is concerned. But one feature of love that I think many great philosophers have noticed, such as Paul McCartney, is that there is a tendency for love to actually magnify and grow, and for the amount of love in the world to actually continue to increase. There's a kind of equation in that McCartney gave that I think is not quite right. But the basic point is if you love, it's productive of more love, I think is important and correct. And in other places, I've tried to explain what leads to that productivity of love, what I call love's escalator, that once you start loving, love becomes more prevalent. And there's two properties of love that I think help to explain that. Now, so this is what I want to say just about the concept of love. But in order to really try to resolve this apparent paradox, we also have to say something about nature and what kind of thing nature is. Now, the first thing to say is that there is a general skepticism that many people have about the whole concept of nature. And I'm happy to talk about that in discussion. And I've talked about it in other places, but I do want to put it aside for the purposes of this talk. And there's essentially three different sources for this skepticism about nature. There are some people who think there really just is no such thing as nature. They think that, for example, for something to be nature, it has to be completely unaffected by humanity. Humanity affects everything, hence there is no nature. I think that's just a misunderstanding of the conditions that something has to satisfy in order to be nature. There are other people who think that nature is a social construction. Again, I think there's a kind of fundamental error that is made to move from nature is a social construction to thinking there's no such thing as nature. It's like saying that the concept of a cup is a social construction. Therefore, there is no such thing as a cup. Something seems to be succeeding in holding the water. And then there's kind of a normative argument that people sometimes give against the concept of nature, that to see things as being natural is to see them as being in some way morally acceptable. And so we actually, it's not that there is no such thing as nature so much as we ought not to see things as in any way natural or coming from nature, because this will lead us to accept the world and its practices as it is. Now, I think I've said enough for you to know that I don't think these arguments work, but nevertheless, there's a lot of people, particularly broadly in the humanities, who do have a general skepticism about the whole idea of nature. And it must be said that that the concept of nature, or trying to understand what we want to count as being part of nature or what is natural, is complicated. So here is another object of my love. This is my dog Dan. Now Dan has had a long and interesting life. He was obviously the product of a puppy mill. He was almost created as an artifact for human consumption uh, and satisfaction. But then he became a street dog in South Korea, where he had his own life and his own autonomy until he actually wound up in a high kill shelter. And at that point, he was rescued by some people, and he eventually found his way into living a very, very comfortable, coddled life in New York City, which is where he is now. Now, is Dan part of nature? Is he not part of nature? How do we think about Dan? Not so simple. And it gets even more complicated when we start thinking about some other animals. So this is Dan, complicated Dan, looking out the window, and what Dan is seeing is an animal that's supposed to be a wild animal and presumably part of nature, namely a deer, which in fact has become quite domesticated, grazing around the back garden. And with the deer are these feral cats. Now, these feral cats are supposed to presumably be not part of nature. They're household cats, except these feral cats are as vicious as any tiger that you would find in any jungle anywhere. Um, so what do we have here? This crazy little dog looking at this supposedly wild animal and the supposedly domestic animal. What's nature here? What's not nature here? In the Anthropocene, we have reason to be confused. And it goes beyond animals. Wildfires that aren't directly caused by humans, but caused by things like lightning strikes, or at least ignited by things like lightning strikes, their frequency and their nature is increasingly affected by climate change. And there's a whole story of the mechanism by which that takes place. What do we say about these wildfires? Are they now not natural, even if they're ignited by lightning strikes? Um, where do we draw the line? How do we think about that? And even polar bears, which seem like the epitome of a wild animal, are finding their lives seriously and deeply affected by human action, namely climate change, as the ice caps increasingly disappear, which the polar bears require in order to feed themselves, in order to hunt. So there's a lot of complications as we enter the Anthropocene and in a world in which the human footprint on everything is so great. But nevertheless, I think we can still provide a definition of nature or an account of nature that will serve to demark some cases, even if the line is not always entirely bright. So, and also there are multiple senses of nature. I'm just simply trying to give an account here of nature in one sense. And my account basically says that something is part of nature if it is independent of human creation and sustaining. Now, this criterion admits of degree. Some things are more independent, some things are less independent. Some wild animals may not be fully independent of human sustaining, but they may be on the whole independent. Our judgment about whether something counts as nature may also be affected by what we are comparing it to, either explicitly or implicitly. So we may say, for example, that Antarctica is more a part of nature, and we often use in English the adjective here, more natural, which we can read as being part of nature, than, say, Amazonia, which is much more affected by human action. And we might say that Amazonia today is less natural or less part of nature than Amazonia yesterday. So we make these comparative judgments. We think of what is natural or what is nature as being a matter of degree, but the fundamental axes of this are that to be part of nature is to be in some way relatively independent of human creation and sustaining. Now, I think there are two ways in which we can love nature, and they're actually quite different in interesting ways. And just to make these simple, I'm going to call one mother love and the other partner love because they are quite analogous to the love that we have for our mothers and the love that we have for our partners. So mother love is an attitude in which the individual, that is the object of love, are the systems that bring us into the world, that essentially make our lives possible. And these are things like the hydrological cycle, the atmosphere, um, all of these natural cycles that have brought us into existence and sustain our lives. The other way in which we can love nature is what I call partner love. And partner love is the love that many people have for specific places, like Glen Canyon, for example, or for particular animals, or for particular species. So partner love is love for certain aspects of nature. Mother love is love for the general systems that have produced life on the planet. And I think it's important to distinguish these because when people talk about loving nature, it's the very different things are going on in these two cases. Now, as we move now into the tension or the paradox that I want to explore, we have to begin, I think, with the idea, with the recognition that nature is not a peaceable kingdom. And I think it's important to recognize how deep and how powerful that image of nature is, the one that has been certainly given to people in the West by the Judeo-Christian tradition. And although I think most people wouldn't deny what John Stuart Mill says about nature or deny what Dawkins says about nature, I think for many people, if we were to just go around and ask them, what is your image of nature? Many people would sort of conjure up this idea of the peaceable kingdom, that that's really what nature is about. It's not. And of course, the other image is an image that we also get from poetry. This is a quotation from a poem by Alfred Lord Tennyson, and it's in this quotation that this idea of nature red in tooth and claw comes from. And Tennyson is concerned with a particular sort of theological version of our paradox, if you will, about how it can be that there's a benevolent God and there is so much pain and suffering in nature. Um, and I think it's interesting to bring Tennyson into this because we're very close in talking about the paradox or tension with which I began to traditional discussions of the problem of evil in philosophy of religion. And the fact that these stances can in some way be almost theological in orientation, having to do with sort of ultimate commitments rather than what can really be reasoned, I think comes from just comparing statements by two writers. So on the left is the American nature writer Annie Dillard, who writes, I came from the world. I crawled out of a sea of amino acids, and now I must whirl around and shake my fist at that sea and cry shame. So Dillard here is denouncing the mother that gave birth to her, if you will. This is a terrible, evil, horrible thing that I came from. I was born in this shame, in this misery. Holmes Ralston III, who is a philosopher and also a theologian, says, if I were Aphrodite rising from the sea, I think I would turn back, reflect on that event, and rather raise both hands in cheer. And if I came to realize that my rising out of the misty sea involved a long struggle of life renewed in the midst of its perpetual perishing, I might well fall to my knees in praise. So, radically different attitudes towards the mother that has brought us into existence on the part of two contemporary thinkers. Now, I think the best way, probably the most kind of clearest statement of this sort of negative view, and something here that I think is really important, since on many traditional accounts, going back to Tennyson, and something, by the way, that also was very much in the mind of Darwin, is that nature, after all, was God's creation. It was God who, so to speak, created the mother that birthed us. And Beckett, one of Beckett's characters, says in Endgame, his play from 1957, about God, the bastard, he doesn't even exist. Now, that's a nice little play on the ontological argument, among other things. He's so, because the ontological argument basically says it's part of the virtue of God that he necessarily exists. Bastard is saying, Beckett is saying he's such a bastard, he doesn't even have this quality of existence that was thought by Anselm and others to be a positive quality. Okay, so now then we get to the nub of the question. Why can or should or do we love nature when it does such awful things? And I think the beginning of the answer to that question we get from the philosopher Harry Frankfurt, who recently passed away. And Frankfurt's insight about people is that we don't love someone, or I would say something as well, in virtue of its properties. I don't look out onto the world and I see the most virtuous person in the world, and my love then goes to that person. It doesn't work like that. Among the people and things that I love, some are pretty virtuous, some are pretty not virtuous, right? There's no way of sorting them according to virtue. So Frankfurt's way of putting this point, which I think is terrific, is there are reasons of love, but not reasons for love. So when you ask me why I love someone, I can produce reasons. Once I stand in a loving relationship with someone or something, then I can sort of recite reasons and virtues and things of that nature. But it isn't those reasons that I produce and the virtues to which I allude that are actually the foundation of the love. The love comes first, the reasons come second. So that's why when it comes to people, we can love bad people. And it's an interesting question whether there are people who nobody should love. There may be such people. I don't know. I consider that an open question. But there may be limits in the domain of people who would be the proper objects for anyone to love. But they're very, very broad, right? We don't think that people who've committed crimes and even in some cases done really horrible things just should be loved by no one. I mean, we may not be able to understand how somebody loves them, but we don't think that they are beyond love, that they are unlovable. So, so why then are we disturbed about nature and the pain and suffering of nature, and why that poses a challenge to nature being an object of love? Well, I think there's differences here between loving people and loving nature. The first is that we see human action as intentional. Now, we may have some, and we don't see nature as intentional. So we may have some theory about determinism or something like that that's in the background, but nevertheless, when a murderer kills a victim, this is an intentional act. When there is a killing in nature, it is not an intentional act. That gives us some greater latitude for loving a killer in nature. Humans are also part of our community. We have to live with them in some way. We have to manage those relationships. Nature is radically other. So in loving them, we can just, as it were, being appreciating them without having to figure out whether nature is going to keep its promises or break into my house and steal things. But then a third factor why I think we can accept more of this evil, if you want to call it, in nature, and still think of nature as an object of love, is, again, it goes back to this insight of Murdoch's, that we see our experience of nature is as being of an experience of reality as brute as it can be, unaffected by humans. And for Murdoch, the idea of being in touch with reality is already itself a positive and productive relationship. Whereas having a relationship with a human may in fact be quite distant from this kind of ultimate reality. And ultimately, it may be, and indeed I would argue that it is, this reality that we're in touch with when we love nature is intrinsically tragic, that it's just a fact about reality that in confrontation with humanity and our goals and our desires and our wishes, nature is fundamentally tragic. If nature is fundamentally tragic, how can we say that it's not an appropriate object of love? That's just the nature of nature, so to speak, to be fundamentally tragic. So let me just give you a couple of examples of what I mean about nature being fundamentally tragic. One has to do with predation. Predation, there are philosophers, for example, who write these things about how we should actually, predation involves suffering. We should try to eliminate suffering. We should try to eliminate predation, and then they talk about, sort of turning predators into herbivores or driving them to extinction, all kinds of things like that. But as a matter of fact, predation is one of the most robust phenotypes that evolution produces. There have been predation has occurred multiple times in the history of life on Earth in different kinds of contexts, because it has, in the words of Annabel Tao, a role function in a wide variety of different ecological systems that maximizes the ability to provide resources across multiple species. So predation plays a very important role in the production of biological diversity. So somehow the idea that, you could just sort of take this bit of nature that you don't like, namely predation, and put it aside somehow and still have anything like nature is a fantasy. And I think we can see that it's a fantasy in this recent paper on the evolutionary emergence of predation, where the authors describe an interesting counterfactual, which I'm going to read out. They say, there exists a somewhat mythological concept of Garden of Eden or Shangri-La that describes the state of the biosphere before the appearance of the first predators, where photosynthesizing and chemotrophic cells peacefully floated, using available electromagnetic and chemical energy, perhaps engaging in multilateral symbiosis and even competition, but never killing each other for food consumption. How long such a world could have existed and whether it ever existed at all is still remains the subject of debate. Now, they're actually being a little too gentle with this hypothesis. I think there's 2 points to make about it. The first is whatever that world would be a world in which we could not have evolved, right? So it's a pure thought experiment, if you will. And this world which we're looking down on as a thought experiment is radically different from any world that we have ever experienced or ever could have experienced. Secondly, if life on Earth ever were, as it appears in this thought experiment, it would not have evolutionary stability. That predation would likely emerge in this world. The idea that this could be evolutionarily stable, even if it ever were to exist, is almost impossible to imagine. In fact, if the world ever were like that, the fact that it's not evolutionarily stable is why it no longer exists. So, ultimately, then, we love this thing, nature. Some of us do, with all of its suffering, with all of its death, because it is reality, and reality is in some ways fundamentally tragic. And we don't love things in virtue of their properties. We love them because of the nature of the relationship that we establish between them. And I just want to end by referring you to a book by the American environmentalist Aldo Leopold, the Sand County Almanac, which I think is massively misunderstood. Generally, Leopold is often read as sort of having a kind of theory of environmental ethics, which I think is completely untrue. And what's marvelous about this book is that it takes the stance towards nature that I think we should take, which is a stance of appreciation, of questioning, of asking questions, of forming relationship without ever really thinking that it can be the full object of a theoretical understanding. In fact, far from being a philosopher in the traditional sense, at the end of his life, Leopold wrote a letter, and now the print is very small, so I have to get very close to read it out to you because I think it's important. He said, in a letter written only weeks before he died, Leopold wrote that he lacked a completely logical philosophy all thought out. In fact, on the contrary, I am deeply disturbed and do not myself know the answer to the conflicting needs with which we are faced. And I think that that is the only attitude towards nature, even if we love it, that is, in the end, intellectually viable and sustainable. So I just want to end by showing you a place, a part of nature that I love. This is Torrey Pines, which is an area just north of San Diego, California, where I grew up. And it's a place where I grew up swimming in that ocean, surfing in that ocean. And this tree that you see is a specific species of pine tree, which exists only in a very small area there, and is, of course, under pressure of extinction as well. So thank you very much for your attention.